Folks, thank you for joining me today. Before we dive into this one, brief disclaimer. It really should go without saying, but absolutely brief disclaimer here. I am not medically qualified to diagnose or treat any eating disorders of any kind. If you are really struggling with this, get specialised help. I absolutely encourage you to do that. These are just my thoughts and opinions on this matter today. Without any further ado, let's dive straight into this thing, shall we? Thank you very much for joining me. Will I get some live Q&A after this? Who knows? If I've got time, absolutely. But really, folks, my focus today is to really do an in-depth both unpacking and sort of troubleshooting of binge eating, and hopefully give you some ideas about what the next steps might be for you. Again, once more, I am not medically qualified to diagnose or treat these matters. These are just my thoughts and opinions before we dive in. So what is binge eating? And I know this might sound really tedious, but the reason why I must lay this out for you is because a lot of people think they're bingers, they're perhaps not. And vice versa, actually, a lot of people don't realise that they do have a binge eating issue. They think it's just a regular sort of craving or occasional giving in to temptation. Binge eating is very specific in what it actually means. So here it is. Eating large quantity of foods, in a sense, over a short period of time. That's what binge eating is. If you give into a craving, that doesn't automatically make it binge eating. As I say, a lot of people conflate these things. As you can imagine, there's a bit of overlap. But really the thing to stress is that binge eating is not merely overindulgence. It isn't just giving into a little bit of vegan chocolate or a burger or going out to eat from time to time. That's not what binge eating is. Those things are fairly regular cravings. And why we have to make this distinction is because the process we take in tackling these things, I argue, ought to be very, very different. I think the thing to stress with binge eating is it feels more like a compulsion than just an overindulgence or a regular craving. This is, as I say, eating a large amount of food, serious quantities, 2,000 calories, for instance, in a very short space of time, 2,000 calories in an hour or two. That, folks, is better termed as binge eating rather than just giving into a craving and so on. This goes, once again, this goes a lot deeper than merely overindulgence, let's say. Characteristically, binge eating, I believe, can be either both, well, it can be both spontaneous, very much in the moment, or planned. So, you know, in terms of the spontaneity aspect, it could be that you're walking around the grocery store one day, you see a couple of foods that might trigger you. Before you know it, you've thrown a load in your basket, you head to the checkout. What's the first thing you do when you get in your car? You go straight for that vegan chocolate. By the time you get home, you're having those Impossible or Beyond burgers. There is sometimes a degree of spontaneity to this. In many cases, though, it's also planned, which people find surprising, since there's such a strong emotional, let's say, psychological component to binge eating. The fact that it seems so planned can often surprise people. It's not always as impulsive as you might imagine it to be. Some people, they literally set a time or a certain day of the week where they choose to go ahead and have their binges. And there might be certain reasons behind that timing, but they're very specific in actually planning it out. So if you do find yourself doing something like this, and you are perhaps planning ahead of time in these short bursts of consuming lots of calories, this is very likely, again, I don't know all the ins and outs, so this is a blanket statement, it's a very good chance that this is a binge eating problem rather than just a regular craving, which again, I've got strategy to deal with. I don't mean to downplay cravings or giving into cravings, but this is something very specific. Okay, this is a separate problem, I argue. Again, there's lots of overlap. Some people would define binge eating as a mental illness, binge eating disorder as a mental illness. I wouldn't be so quick to do so. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of that debate here today. That's perhaps for a live stream further down the line. I think it's something that a lot of people can really suffer from for a lot of reasons, and to brand it as a mental illness in a very blanket manner, I think that would be a huge mistake, actually, but we'll get into that another time. Binge eating is often triggered by negative emotion, of course. It could also be, as I said earlier, a set time. You've planned it ahead, so you'll know you're going to do it. Maybe it's in 3 days' time, or you think, okay, tomorrow afternoon I'm going to do this. Or for most people, it's not so planned out. It's maybe on the day, and you say, okay, this afternoon after I go to the gym, I'm going to have a bit of a binge, and that's seriously what people will do after the gym. And there's maybe some kind of causal link there as well, which we could get into later if we have time. But it is typically triggered by negative emotion, as I say. It is then, therefore, somewhat impulsive to a certain degree, but some people do also set a time, as I said earlier. I think the big thing to stress in terms of binge eating's association with emotional eating, because there are many strands, as lots of you will know, especially those of you in my weight loss academy, many strands of emotional eating. And so worth mentioning the likes of stress, worth mentioning the likes of boredom, reward-based eating, and so on. A lot of these things can, of course, drive binge eating, but I find that one of the trickiest actually to deal with, in my experience, is trauma-based sort of emotional eating / binge eating. Those that have perhaps suffered accidents or abuse, this makes dealing, I think, with binge eating really, really problematic, and there's a number of reasons for that, such as damaged receptors and so on, and sort of oversaturation of certain brain circuitry and whatnot. I'm putting that in a very simplistic manner, to say the least. A neurologist, if they were listening to this, would go, Ryan, that's awfully simple. But with trauma-based eaters anyway, I do think binge eating is really, really tricky to deal with. I realise as I say that I'm not really posing a solution, but we'll come on to my solutions, or my thoughts, I should say. What I would consider if I was suffering from binge eating. I'll cover those later on, but worth mentioning that many things that can trigger binge eating, many different emotions, usually negative. I say usually negative, sometimes people binge as a way of celebrating, would you believe, as a way of decompressing. These aren't necessarily negative emotions. But again, it's that it's that manifestation of sort of emotional eating. It's that manifestation of trying to find something outside of ourselves to fix something inside of ourselves. Using food to take the edge off, stuff, soothe, or suppress a certain feeling, numb a certain feeling, and with trauma being a really tricky one to deal with when it comes to binge eating. But yeah, stress, boredom, loneliness, anxiety, although I always argue, or I often argue, that anxiety actually can reduce appetite for many people that often feel anxious, more so than the others, which actually elevate appetite, I would say, in most cases. What else then? Binging behaviour can be enhanced in a weight loss phase. This is really important to mention, obviously, for my audience, where the calorie deficit is particularly harsh, or where there are perceived, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, perceived feelings of restriction. Why do I add in the word perceived? Because it might be your perception that you are being restricted, when that might not actually necessarily be the case. Now, technically, you could argue on paper, as soon as you follow a healthy eating plan, you are somewhat limited, you are somewhat restricted, because it takes away some degree of freedom. However, what I would argue with this, and why I would argue that these feelings are in many cases perceived, not always, is that because most people don't eat that much variety anyway, even if they're not trying, especially when they're not trying to eat healthily. But people don't have so much variety in their diets anyway. Most people, regardless of whether they want to lose weight, they don't care about their health, they don't care about weight management, they eat between 4 and 6 meals a week, don't they? This is very anecdotal from me, I'm not pulling up any data on this. But most people, observationally, don't have a whole lot of variety in their diet. They eat the same couple of things every week because it sort of works for them, maybe their budget, their schedule, maybe they enjoy that food, and they sort of get stuck with it for years or maybe decades. Bit of rotation every now and again. And that's why I say perceived feelings of restriction, because it might just be that, yeah, you've got some caps, you've got some clear boundaries, but within that, isn't necessarily that you're being restricted. I suppose deprivation is another similar word, although that's slightly different. Deprivation would most certainly stress the calorie perspective, wouldn't it? Rather than restriction, which is more to do with the freedom of the food you're eating, although you could then cite the term calorie restriction. We're getting lost in the semantics, folks, but binge eating behavior, my point on this, can often be enhanced in a weight loss phase for a couple of reasons. That's really important to note, of course, for my audience here. I'll talk about how to deal with that a little bit later on too, of course. Thanks everyone for joining me. I maybe will get to some questions. I think I will have time to get to some questions here. If you're just joining me, I'm running through how to stop binge eating, just sort of defining early on here the characteristics of binge eating. Worth stressing once again that I'm not a specialist in this area. If you are suffering from this, please go and see a doctor. Please go and see someone qualified in this arena. That is not me. I'm just sharing my thoughts and opinions with you here, of course, today. I don't mean to downplay it, this is something I have learned a great deal about, of course. Worth stressing, I am a weight loss coach. This is not my area of expertise, nor am I qualified to treat and diagnose eating disorders of any kind. That's worth mentioning. Characteristics then. of binge eating, you go well beyond satiation. You feel physical discomfort at the amount you eat. Maybe you feel a little bit ill, of course, as a result of that. You often eat in private. You hide doing this. There are certain feelings of shame and embarrassment. And so to avoid those things, you like to do this alone. There's almost this sense that you sort of like locking yourself away. Some people who actually live with others will even do this in their room and make sure the door is locked, bolted, and there's a chair in between somebody being able to get in. Seriously, people will do this. And there is maybe a certain state of paranoia that comes over us when we are binge eating, because even the knock of a door or someone ringing our phone, in our mind, they're catching us out. They're going to bust us for this thing. That's the way that people often feel when they are binge eating. They would much prefer to do it, of course, in private because of those feelings of embarrassment, shame, guilt, and so on. Of course, in a similar vein, I just mentioned guilt there. Huge feelings of guilt after the fact, after the binge eating session has ended. And interestingly, and this is a massive trait with any form of emotional eating, not that I would call binge eating a form of emotional eating. They are, what should we say, relative cousins, siblings, if you will, both stemming from emotions, but slightly different in terms of their meaning and definitions. But what I would say on this, just to get back to my point here, I'm all over the shop today, aren't I, folks? Lots of tangents and loops opening up. I guess I just want to make sure I go in depth on what is a tricky subject to deal with. But people often opt anyway, to get back to the point, for certain special foods. Big sign, as I say, with emotional eating, is people actually heavily discriminate in terms of the foods they want to eat when their appetite, their hunger is being dictated by emotion. Huge sign that you maybe have a problem with binge eating is if you do gravitate towards certain foods where you have these times where you eat large quantities of food in a certain period. You're very particular. It might be the same foods as last time. Every now and again you might introduce something new, but very rarely. Usually it's the same couple of foods. You might even be very specific about the brand or the type of ice cream you have, the exact flavour. And actually, so much so that if you get to the store and you know you're going to do this and you get to the store and there isn't that flavour in, you will be really annoyed by that. You'll be really triggered by that. So big sign that you have a problem with binge eating is if you find yourself opting for certain foods when you do these hauls and you get a bunch of junk in your basket and head to the checkout, or in your trolley and head to the checkout. You opt for certain foods, certain brands over and over. A couple of different foods, not much variety at all. And again, there's a number of reasons why you opt for those certain foods. Maybe if we have time, we'll get into that later. Although, yeah, maybe it's not so urgent right now. I mean, that last point is tricky because emotional eating, you know, it could be, as I mentioned earlier, a regular craving, whatever that means. We could lose ourselves in lots of definitions here. But this makes it hard to distinguish. If you do have cravings for certain particular foods, that doesn't mean you're a binge eater, quote unquote. That's worth stressing. But again, a characteristic of binge eating, you always opt for certain foods, very rarely rotate. Binge eating tends to be slightly more common in women than men. There is a small genetic component to this. Of course, if a parent struggled with this, maybe there's a genetic link for you. Maybe you have a higher risk of this genetically, of suffering with this rather genetically. So I think just to really wrap this up here before we move into my solutions today, just on the introduction, talking about what binge eating is, if you're just joining me here, and the characteristics of it. I think the biggest causes, we can put this into two brackets really. First and foremost, I just mentioned the genetic component there, but first and foremost, two main brackets: psychological, of course, and dieting. So that dieting aspect. So it's not just that people dieting suffer from binge eating. It goes across the spectrum, it really does. But it can be enhanced with dieting, and I'll talk about why that is the case and what to do about it a bit later, shortly actually here. But dieting can really do that too. So if you're in a weight loss phase, obviously this is really prevalent to my audience. If you're in a weight loss phase, this can really enhance feelings of binge eating. This can really enhance, problems with binge eating, feelings towards binging. But particularly, even to the extent for many people, binge eating wasn't something they actually suffered from prior to actually wishing to lose weight, which is really interesting, very ironic, isn't it? So let's get into the why. I'm just going to read a couple of comments here. Good morning, Ryan. Hi, Alan. Thanks for joining. What do you use, phone, camera type, microphone, to make videos and live chats? So right now with these lives, I actually have got my laptop here. Otherwise, I do it all on my laptop. And I actually film with my phone. That just makes it a bit easy for me, because if you only do it on the phone, if I didn't have my laptop here, it's really hard to see the questions. So this is much easier for me. to have this. So, but for my regular videos, I use a Canon. Frankly, I can't remember the name. I think Canon M50 actually. It's just sprung to mind. I think it's a Canon M50 for my regular YouTube videos. But this is just my iPhone. Excuse me. I honestly don't even know what the iPhone I've got is. It's an X or an XS or one of those in the X range. I don't know. There's probably about 60 of them nowadays, aren't there? Alan, man, I went to dinner near my. I presume NY stands for New York. Funny. Oh, no, I don't know what that means. How they had nothing for vegans, no oat milk. Okay, let's dive into the solutions, folks. So if you're just joining me now, I'm talking about how to stop binge eating. I outlined what binge eating was. If you're just joining, basically breaking it down into its most simple soundbite: eating large quantities of food in a very short period of time. Overindulgence, the occasional craving, that is not the same as binging. Absolutely must get these definitions straight. I know I sound really pedantic on this, but the reason why I've spent 15 minutes talking about this, folks, and the characteristics of binge eating is so you're able to correctly identify it, because it changes the solution involved. Binge eating is more of a compulsion than just a craving, a regular temptation that once in a while you give into. This is consuming a crazy amount of calories, maybe 2,000 calories in a short period of time, as 90 minutes or 2 hours or so. It can be both planned and spontaneous. It is often triggered by negative emotion. Trauma in particular can be a real big driver of binge eating and make it, frankly, very tricky to stop. What else? You go well beyond satiation, you often feel ill, perhaps you eat in private. These are signs that you might have a binge eating issue. I stress might have a binge eating issue. It's important to diagnose this correctly so you can find the appropriate solution. Once again, seek advice on this, folks. This is not an area in which I am trained. These are just my thoughts and opinions. So solutions that I would consider, it's important that I get my wording right on this again, and solutions that I would then consider if I was struggling with binge eating, knowing what I now know. First point on this is to reinforce a healthy body image. Really, really important. Brief little mantra for this: what you value, you take care of. What you value in life, you tend to, not always, take care of. You might have a funny way of showing it if it's a person in your life or a commitment that you've got, but generally, what you value, you take care of. A lot of people chastise themselves. A lot of people chastise their body. They really disregard. They really have perhaps hatred even or disgust towards the way they look. The problem with this, there's many problems with this, as you can imagine, certainly mentally, emotionally. But the problem with this from a binge eating perspective is really when you're on the same side as your body, when you are a little bit more forgiving with yourself, you can take care of your body a little bit better. You are of the mindset to treat it better, and this is, by the way, consciously and subconsciously. Treat it better, to feed it more nourishing foods, rather than further punish it and harm it because you don't see it as valuable. Does that make sense? So what you value, you take care of. If you do value your body, and by the way, this isn't me coming out with some body positive line about, loving yourself the way you are right now, even though you might be very, very overweight and you might be struggling with your health right now, and it's very much under your control if it is under your control. This isn't me saying love yourself for that. This isn't me saying don't make sure that you have standards and want to improve. That's not me saying this at all. You guys know my thoughts on this. I think that body positive stuff really, it's an ideology, frankly, and it's gone very well too far, especially here in the UK from my observation. So you probably know my stance on this already. I've been talking about it a little bit more recently. But at the same time, you don't want to beat yourself up so harshly that you do see your body as something that is worth punishing, that isn't worth anything, that is useless, that from a health perspective you're completely inept. You have to value it so that you can feed it right, so that you can prioritize your health, so that you can take care of it. Does that make sense? I think the tricky thing with this is a lot of people hear me on this and say, right, that makes perfect sense. But, a lot of them derive, a lot of people, I mean, myself included at times, derive so much self-worth from the way they look, from the aesthetics, from their weight. And so really the best solution I can offer here, although tricky to do, admittedly, is to redistribute your self-worth, to realize, and I know this sounds cliche and very corny, and we all know this stuff inherently, but do we act as though we really know this? Not always. But to recognize, your value in other areas, the inherent value. What else do you bring to the world? Because, okay, admittedly, you might be out of shape right now, and yeah, that's holding you back, perhaps, in many, many ways, beyond just the superficial, of course, aspect of it. But, personal, professional commitment, spiritually, self-worth can be derived in many, many ways. You can give yourself gratification and validation in many, many ways. So to only think that that number on the scale or exactly what you see in the mirror is the sum total of the value you can give to the world, well, that's a huge mistake. Again, this is something we all know. It's not rocket science. But is that something we all necessarily feel every day? No, not always, especially when we have this huge pain point, perhaps, about our weight and the way we look and so on. So what I want to stress to you is that you have to reinforce a healthy body image by, in order to do that, you have to redistribute your self-worth. Again, this is a fine balance and it's a spectrum. As I said earlier, and I will cover this a bit later, you can go too far in sort of berating yourself, and you can go too far in being too kind on yourself and coming out with these lines that you'll often hear now in mainstream culture, such as love yourself exactly the way you are, you're beautiful at any weight, so on and so forth, you're healthy at any weight, even more dangerous, of course. You can go too far on either end of the spectrum. There is a decent middle ground on this, where you have standards, where you absolutely admit your shortcomings, work towards improving, but you do have some semblance of forgiveness here. You do have some semblance of self-care, so that you can treat yourself well, so that you can, it's a no-brainer that you feed yourselves these good foods. What happens subconsciously when you don't value the way you look right now, when you chastise yourself, quote unquote, too much, whatever that looks like, that's going to be slightly different for everyone, but when you chastise yourself too much, what happens is you subconsciously, maybe sometimes consciously, have this idea in your mind, you have this set belief that you're not worth it, that you don't deserve any better, so may as well keep piling in the junk food, eh? And then what happens? Well, you can imagine. So are you really going to nip this binging in the bud when you're not on your own team like that? No, not really. So there needs to be some semblance of forgiveness here. I'll talk about that a little bit more on a later point. Thanks for just joining me today, folks. I'm talking about how to stop binge eating. Maybe I'll get some questions a bit later on, so leave them in the chat. I won't guarantee it. I should think we'll have time, but I can't quite guarantee it. Okay. Also, next big tip on this is that you have to fix the pattern. It's worth me mentioning, I'm going to talk about diet shortly because it can play a role, but no diet is going to totally fix this. It can be exaggerated, as I mentioned earlier. In a heavy dieting or weight loss phase, binge eating can come out even more in a weight loss phase. But even a good diet, even a healthy, clean diet, it's not going to necessarily, anyway, completely fix the underlying behavior. And that's the problem. So you can still be on a whole foods plant-based diet, and I speak to people, I would actually say it's daily, I was about to say near daily, but it's probably several times a day, who have this very problem, in that they still suffer from binge eating. Their diet is relatively clean, they're doing a bit of exercise, they're doing lots of things in terms of their health, wellness, fitness, nutrition, and so on, quote unquote, right, but they're still suffering from binge eating. Why? Why is that? Well, in many cases, a couple of reasons, but it tends to be, in my experience talking to these folks, that the pattern of behavior is still there, and they just carry it from one diet to another. So it doesn't matter how much you clean things up on paper in the vast majority of your diet, that massive inconsistency every weekend or every couple of days that comes with binge eating, that is not massively related to what you're doing on those good days. It's really not, because the pattern of behavior is still there. As I say, a lot of people, they just take it from one diet to another, so they have a terrible, excuse my language, but crappy is probably the best word that springs to mind, standard American diet. Maybe they go whole foods, plant-based, maybe they make that vegan switch even, and then in a dietary sense, they maybe really clean up their diet, of course getting rid of the animal products, maybe getting some junk food out of their diet, but the binging is still there. Because really the diet, they are seeing it really as a mask to those problems. And it might help, there might be some overlap, and I'm going to talk about how diet can help you with binge eating, because it absolutely can. But the problem is, you don't fix or address the underlying behavior. Maybe the diet has an indirect effect on your behavior, and that helps, but the diet itself doesn't tend to do anything magical if you still have this terrible pattern of behavior brewing beneath the surface, let's say. It's only a matter of time before that's going to manifest, especially with something like binge eating. It is frequent. Binge eating, by the way, this is worth stressing too. You don't do it once a month. If you're a binge eater, it's happening at least weekly. It definitely is happening weekly, if not more regularly than that. So it's a pattern, folks. The emotional eating cycle is something I talk about in my academy. It's something I briefly talk about in Mind Mastery for Weight Loss. For those who have that, if you don't, naturalweightlossmastery.com, cheeky plug there. The emotional eating cycle is something that strengthens and strengthens with time. I think the thing to stress with binge eating is that each time you do it, you become more and more powerless to it. Each time you do it, you reinforce the pattern of behavior in your mind. Does it then become harder to break? You bet, of course it does. It's definitely something that could be nipped in the bud, quote unquote, a lot earlier. If you've only had a few binges in your time, let's say you go into a weight loss phase, these feelings of binging become really pronounced, it's going to be easier in the first couple of weeks to get that thing fixed than years down the line, quite obviously. That repetition really cements in the pattern of behavior. So, yeah, I mean, I mentioned the emotional eating cycle there. This is, and I've got another cycle to walk you through shortly, which I think is really wonderful that I found online earlier. But this is definitely something that gets stronger and stronger and stronger each time you repeat it. You get weaker and weaker and weaker. This becomes more of a vulnerability each time you go through this. So that's worth mentioning too. So if you're deep into binge eating and you've been doing this for years and years and years, I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to be really tough to break because you've done it so many times. And that should probably be fairly obvious. Perhaps it's something you've really tried to work on in the past, perhaps to varying degrees of success. But yeah, generally it's going to be harder the longer you've been doing this because you've really cemented, I think is the best word for this, in that behavior. Does that make sense, folks? So that's really important to know. I mentioned this a second ago, I really like breakbingeeating.com's binge eating cycle. There's no starting point on this cycle, but I'm going to start with extreme dietary restraint. So this is when you're in a weight loss phase. Maybe this is a huge calorie deficit, but there's some kind of dietary restraint. Maybe it's a certain food group that you eliminate, low carb, high carb, so on and so forth. I'm not going to say if I agree or disagree with these things. Let's just take this as it is. Extreme dietary restraint. Then that follows on to periods of binge eating and perhaps purging. We haven't even spoken about purging. I'm not going to do that in this video, but extreme dietary restraint, which leads people to binging and purging, those feelings of deprivation or restriction, limitation, become so overwhelming that eventually scoff. A lot of people know this cycle. I don't need to talk about it too much. Then this also feeds into the overvaluation of weight and body image. And then we go back to and I was about to say back to the start. There is no start because it all constantly feeds, like my emotional eating cycle model. This constantly feeds around. So we have this extreme dietary restraint. We get so sick of that dietary restraint that we think, oh, I can't hack this anymore. Binge, however long that lasts. This feeds into an overvaluation of weight and body image because we've punished ourselves, because we're doing something against ourselves, because we then even feel really guilty because we have these weight loss ambitions, we have these health efforts, and we've just binged so heavily, even though we've been working so hard, too hard, we can obviously argue, but we've been working so hard, and this just feeds back into this idea that we are really reliant on our weight and our body image for our self-worth. So you just get stuck in this state where you go round and round and round. And because, again, then we feel that we really value our weight and body image, perhaps overvalue in many cases our weight and our body image, we look for that next diet, that extreme dietary restraint again. I really like that model. Thanks, Larry, for joining, even though this, as you say, isn't particularly relevant to you. This is fascinating, really fascinating stuff. So even if you aren't suffering from binge eating, there are certain patterns of behavior, there's certain overlap with different types of cravings and emotional eating that I think will probably resonate with you here, that I hope will serve you well anyway. So thank you for joining me anyway. But yeah, really important to mention that this is a cycle and it's going to be tough to break because it feeds and it feeds and it grows and it grows. It's very much like a snowball, okay? The more snow you add to it, the bigger, the more out of control, the tougher it gets to stop. So I think that's probably the best analogy for it, really. So yeah, this perhaps isn't giving so much hope to those of you who've been suffering from binge eating for years and years and years. But I must be very transparent and honest. If you've been doing this a long time, you've really repeated this action, this pattern of behavior again and again and again, it's cemented, it's going to be tough. But at least having some awareness now, you can sort of go into this and be in a lot better frame of mind to tackle this, rather than just succumbing to it and not observing the pattern happening. That's really the first step with many of the facets of the mental and emotional side of weight loss. The first step, as I talk about in Mind Mastery, is awareness. You must have this ability to spot these patterns of your behavior. This is why journaling is such a profound tool, because you can actually sit down and write things out and get your thoughts on paper and observe in a way that maybe you couldn't tap into just with your mind and just being sort of trapped in the moment and very much feeling like we do, a victim to these things. Why can't I stop this binging? It happens all the time. We very much feel like a victim to these things, which absolutely has a degree of truth to it. We are, but it's not productive to believe you are by any means. Absolutely very disempowering. And so when you can sort of observe these things and develop this sort of awareness by watching trainings like this and doing your own research and doing a bit of journaling and reflecting on your own behavior, it allows you to see the pattern more clearly next time. That's important step number one. Then you need a good strategy to break the pattern, of course, but awareness is step number one. So I do hope you're finding this useful in developing your awareness on this, folks. Thank you for joining me once again. My next note here, mindless versus mindful. Binge eating tends to be an extremely mindless behavior. You suddenly look down and the packet of chips is completely finished. You suddenly look down and there's no ice cream left. You are on autopilot. You are smashing it down. Again, often this is triggered by negative emotion. So maybe you're in this mode where you're numb. Your mind is very much elsewhere and you're just using this thing, aka the food, although people will use other vices to fix or to try really to attempt to fix these negative emotions, these overwhelming emotions. But you suddenly look down at the ice cream, nothing left. And there's a classic example again of emotional eating, of which binge eating is a tangent of, it's not the right word, a sibling of. I used the example of cousin, that's probably better than sibling. Sibling would suggest they're closer than they are, but there's a great deal of overlap and similar behavior at play, but two different things, not even comparable. But yeah, both emotional eating, both binge eating, very, very mindless indeed, very, very mindless indeed. The goal, therefore, as you can quite obviously predict with this, is to be more mindful in this process of eating, to really taste and chew every bite. To be very much present in the moment when you are eating. Maybe that means you turn off screens. But as I say with binge eating, it doesn't matter if you turn off the screens, it doesn't matter. If you are in the binge eating zone, if that is very much the pattern of behavior you're following, you're going to binge eat regardless of probably what's happening around you. It's going to be very mindless. But something I just want to mention is how mindless it can be. So maybe I should have put this in the characteristics section earlier, but if you often find that you are scoffing down the calories and it feels very mindless and you suddenly look at, you're down at your bowl of food and you think, where on earth did that go? Good example that there's a huge psychological component to this. And when we're more mindful, it obviously gives us more control. When we're mindless, we surrender control to those urges, the deep, dark, forces, perhaps I'm dramatizing it a bit here, but forces of the human condition, the human psyche. Mindless versus mindful, worth taking a note of. Onto the dietary aspect, not onto the dietary aspect of this, onto the dietary aspect of solving this problem. High volume foods can really help with binging. I mentioned earlier, and you might have missed this if you're just joining, but I did mention earlier that it doesn't matter what diet you follow. If that pattern of binging is still very much underlying in your behavior, it's going to manifest, it's going to find a way out, it's going to be brewing just below the surface. It's going to catch you at some point. It's not going to be long that you can keep it at bay. How long, I don't know for you, but it's not going to be long. It's not going to be more than a couple of weeks, certainly in my experience, before it sort of comes out and manifests. So, doesn't matter. You can go from a standard Western diet where you're eating a bunch of rubbish. You can go to completely cleaning up your diet, coming to this whole foods plant-based direction, for example, and you can still suffer with binge eating because the underlying behavior is still there. You must fix the behavior. You must fix the pattern. You need a multifaceted approach. Having said all of that, the caveat is that there is a certain diet that I do really believe can help with this, and shock horror, it's the diet that I follow, it's the diet that I propose. High volume foods. Okay, so you can lose weight without the hunger, without the feelings of anger and malnourishment. And these, let's also remember, these are very healing foods. The fiber, the vitamins, the minerals and so on, the antioxidants, the phytochemicals. These are healing foods that don't give us the roller coaster of highs and lows, the dopamine spikes, the dopamine drop-offs, and all those chemicals and additives and whatnot that junk food provides. Okay, it's not so much of a roller coaster. These are healing foods, generally speaking. And so to be able to eat these low calorie density, high volume, fiber rich, water rich foods, it does allow you to eat generous portions in many cases and still lose weight. Does that mean you can eat as much as you want? Does that mean that that's automatically going to stop binge eating? No, of course not. But you can imagine the benefit for many people. Now, again, this is really to do with I mentioned two main causes of binge eating earlier on. One, dieting, two, psychological. And so we're just talking about this from a dieting frame of mind here. There isn't much overlap into the psychological in terms of what I'm talking about here, because if you have the feeling that you want to binge eat, that you're going to binge eat, doesn't matter what diet you follow day in, day out, it ain't going to stop you in the moment. moment. But from a dieting perspective, if you're in a weight loss phase and it really enhances these feelings, the desire, to binge, it can really help to make sure that you're having lots of high volume foods, lots of fruits, veggies, whole grains. I'm preaching to the choir here. My audience is aligned with me on this. There might be 1 or 2 people watching this right now and may watch the playback of this that aren't this way inclined in terms of the nutrition, aren't aligned with me yet on this. So I'm going to speak to those of you now. Look, the whole grains, the fruits, the veggies and whatnot, what they can allow you to do is eat well and still lose weight at the same time. It's not a guarantee. You are still at risk of overeating. As I say, you can still binge eat, you can still overeat here, you can still overconsume on a calorie perspective, but it's harder to do so with this approach to nutrition because of the calories per pound in the likes of fruits, veggies, whole grains, and so on. There are exceptions like nuts and seeds. There are more fat-rich plant foods that come with more calories. But generally speaking, what you can do with this diet is pretty incredible in terms of how you can really hit the spot and still lose at the same time. So it's not a guarantee, but I do think there is overlap here. I do think this can help maybe soften the blow, soften the tendency to binge eat if you're having high volumes of fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes like beans, peas and lentils in your diet. I think that absolutely can really help. Tubers like white potatoes and sweet potatoes. I mean, white potatoes, they're the way they are rated on the satiety index, which in a sense is a scale, not in a sense, it absolutely is a scale for measuring fullness. Must apologize, folks, so I'm really messing up my words today. Scale for measuring the fullness of certain foods. Boiled white potatoes, number 1 on that list. So absolutely amazing in terms of satiation. So white potatoes, great high volume food, very few calories. You can eat these things and feel truly full and satisfied. Will that take away this association that you might have with weight loss whereby it needs to be something that deprives you, that heavily restricts you, that means you have to eat tiny portions? Yeah, this can really go some way to solving the issue. Again, there's a huge psychological component to this. Doesn't matter if you're physically full, it doesn't matter if you have that negative feeling, that negative emotion, if you've embedded this pattern of binge eating over years and years and maybe decades. Doesn't matter how full you feel in the moment, doesn't matter that you filled yourself with lots of whole plant foods that day, you're still going to binge unless you work on fixing that behavior. But as I say, I do think there is some overlap here. I think the tendency, the feeling, the desire maybe to binge can be softened when you eat well, if you're in a weight loss phase, this is. Okay, so that's really important to stress. So again, this is the same stuff from me, folks. This diet is so amazing. This approach to nutrition is so amazing for so many reasons. High volume foods, brilliant. Heavy starch eaters, this is a random point. Looking at my notes here, I don't know why I put this at this point. It probably just sprung to mind. Heavy starch eaters, I noticed there are a lot of people who follow this very high carb plant-based approach, which is one that I advocate. I do advocate a little more fat and protein than perhaps the 80-10-10 philosophy that once graced YouTube many moons back, perhaps a decade or so back. But and something maybe you saw in the more raw vegan community. I say more raw vegan community, I don't mean exclusively, but a more high raw diet. You do see people eating a lot of carbohydrates, not much fat, not much protein. And I think especially, because I think fruit is an exception to this, but I think especially with heavy starch eaters, some of those folks, in my experience, can tap into feelings of satiation, can get, that's not the right way of phrasing it, but can get to a point where they are satiated a lot more readily, a lot more easily when they just have a little bit of fat in their diet. Does that make sense? So for you, it might be, if you have a huge starch component of your diet right now and you've come from maybe a starch solution background and stumbled across my videos, which my stuff is very similar. I've advocated the starch solution on many occasions, love Dr. McDougall's work. But I do think there are some people that if they have a little bit of tahini in their diet, if they have a little bit of oil-free hummus on that note, if they have a bit of avocado, if they have some hemp seeds on their salad, a bit of flaxseed, they can feel more satiated and they can sort of quote-unquote switch off a lot more easily. With a very high carb approach, some people find that they endlessly eat and eat and eat. Not so much of a problem for me, but that satiation that can come from having a few fats in your diet versus an extremely low fat diet, which many people many of my audience do, I think really help. And by the way, I'm not talking about anything dramatic here. I still advocate overall a low-fat diet. But I think it's really, really important to get some of those fats in, not to a huge degree. We can say, everyone's different, Ryan, everyone's different. Well, yeah, of course, everyone is somewhat unique in terms of their goals, what they feel better doing, maybe underlying factors, underlying health issues, and so on. Yeah, okay, everyone's different in terms of their fat intake. But generally speaking, there are patterns and trends here. So low-fat diet is absolutely what I advocate. But those heavy starch eaters, if you find yourself binge eating on starches, because you can, again, I should have covered this earlier, but you can binge eat on healthy foods too. That absolutely is possible. I've seen that quite a startling amount actually since I've started coaching and since I've, well, really started doing all this YouTube stuff as well. I've interacted more so with people that they actually binge eat on clean, whole plant foods. And they might be on a very starch-based approach. A little bit of fat can lessen the damage to some degree. So that might be something you consider trying. Thinking outside the box a little bit there, but that is anecdotally something that I definitely think there's something to. Yeah, my next point, I've mentioned this already. I have witnessed folks binge eat on plant foods. It absolutely is possible, folks. So again, like I said earlier, the pattern of behavior can still be there. You can think that a whole foods plant-based diet is going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to. You still are a human. There are still vulnerabilities there. There are still weaknesses there. And if you have this pattern of binge eating, and as I say, it's ingrained, and it has been for years and years and years, it doesn't matter what diet you follow, it's going to come bubbling to the surface at some point. So yeah, I've absolutely witnessed folks, I suppose I'm just adding this in to dispel rumors, I've absolutely witnessed folks binge eat on plant foods. Do I think that if you move towards a whole foods plant-based diet, you're more susceptible to binge eating? I absolutely do not. In fact, I find the adverse to be true. I think a whole food plant-based diet can really increase the propensity for binge eaters anyway, to stop binge eating. It can definitely help with that overall, I would say. That said, if you don't fix the underlying behavior, you're going to come to this diet and maybe most of the week you're eating cleanly, these whole plant foods. Then at the weekend, or then in these binge eating sessions, I should say more specifically, there's a bunch of junk. In many cases, also it's possible to come to this diet, eat whole foods plant-based, and actually binge eat on whole foods plant-based itself. Does that make sense? Which to some people are so mind-boggling. So I just wanted to dispel that right now. I have absolutely witnessed that. Admittedly, it's a rare bunch. It's a real minority, folks. But I have absolutely witnessed that. And I go back to talking about trauma early on. Did I mention neurological conditions? No, I don't think I did. But this is particularly problematic for those folks that have accidents or perhaps abuse that they've suffered in the past, and they have this deep underlying trauma. We can get trauma from more or less anything. And as I'm going down the rabbit hole here, but as some of you will know, I've been heavily influenced, probably the best word, by Viktor Frankl's work. Viktor Frankl, very famous author of a renowned book, Man's Search for Meaning. And so Viktor Frankl, or I think the analogy he uses for suffering is that it's like a large balloon trapped in a room. If you experience suffering, that balloon is going to fill up. It doesn't matter the perspective. It doesn't matter what that suffering looks like. For everyone, it's going to be different. There are some people that with a bit of perspective have objectively a much worse life than you, have had many terrible things happen to you. But that's not the way suffering works. Suffering doesn't allow room for perspective, and that's a huge tangent, but that's sort of what I learned from reading some of Viktor Frankl's great work. And so I prescribe to that hugely. It's influenced me massively. So I've totally lost my train of thought, folks. But one thing I have noticed anyway, in particular with those that have suffered really serious quote-unquote trauma, although I sort of use that loosely because of the analogy I've just given, that, you know, we can all experience trauma, we all experience suffering, and some of it might seem more trivial compared to others. But really, you know, things like accidents and abuse that become very, very deep-rooted. It is absolutely possible to still binge when you have these problems. I have seen a couple of people who have serious trauma, serious misfortune in their past, binge on plant foods. I don't think so many other people do it. I think it really is to do with the trauma. Again, I've seen no research on this. This is my anecdotal experience. I must stress that. But this is not something I've seen once or twice. This is something I've seen a decent amount of times now for me to start thinking, oh, there's something to this. There's something to this. The vast majority of people who binge eat on a whole foods plant-based diet go to junk. There are a very small bunch of people who binge eat on a plant-based diet and they stay on the plant-based diet when they're binge eating. It's lots of clean whole plant foods. Amazing how many of those folks have deep underlying trauma, and that's the reason for their binge eating. Quite incredible. I do think there's something to that. I'm still trying to work out, solutions to that. Again, this is not my field of expertise, so I don't intend myself to discover a solution to that. I'm still trying to find a reasonable solution to that. But that is a trend I've noticed. So, if you're watching it and that resonates based on your past experiences and whatnot, or you have a neurological condition, as I say, which may have left certain parts of your brain circuitry in a state whereby, can you necessarily gauge satiation that well? Do your receptors for sweetness and bitterness work as well as someone else's because you've saturated them as a way of numbing these past feelings? Does that mean you can maybe overeat more on plant food? Yeah, absolutely. I'm getting lost in this on this particular point, folks, but it's just worth me mentioning that observation because I know chances are there is probably maybe just one or two people out there who really are resonating with what I'm saying here, and they think they're crazy they think they're absolutely unique for binge eating on clean foods. But no, I see this. I see this generally. I do see this every now and again. It's a minority, but worth thinking about this trauma link because I think there's something to that. I've seen it a lot with folks that have that trauma-based eating. Which is really interesting because this is a little tangent as well, but it's just sprung into my mind. Really interesting because emotional eating, as I mentioned earlier, with emotional eating, you do discriminate. Like you do pick certain foods that you want to eat. With physical hunger, you'll eat broccoli, you'll eat mushrooms because you're physically hungry. Your body is requiring nutrients. You don't discriminate. With emotional eating, you get very particular about what the food you want is because it's emotional. It feels like more of an urge. You gravitate towards certain foods. Maybe then, just based on that theory I have, one huge asterisk, one huge caveat is that with trauma-based eating, you actually don't discriminate. You just eat and you eat and you eat. That's interesting because I'm always going on about how one huge characteristic of emotional eating is that you want a certain type of food. With trauma eating, that's not necessarily the case because trauma eaters can binge eat very, very cleanly, if that makes sense. So this is where my mind goes to. So maybe I shouldn't be doing this on my live, but that's something that's worth me looking into more. Let's move on because I've spent too much time on that point. But I just wanted people out there to know who have had massive trauma in their lives. And if you are binging right now on clean foods, again, this is such a small clique of people, but it's worth me stressing because people haven't heard this that suffer with this problem. You're not alone with this. This is something that there is a causal link to this. I think it's to do with receptors. I think it's to do with receptors in the brain that have been saturated and they can't pick up on what somebody that hadn't had that trauma and therefore tried to deal with that trauma in the same way. They haven't had that saturation, their brain receptors. And so with certain foods, it's something I need to become a lot more well-versed in before I reel this off. Certainly in a live stream. So I need to take a more measured stance on this, folks. But go and look into that because there is something to that, I think. And sorry, I can't give you a more formulated and measured view. I will in time. Consistency over perfection is huge. Some people end up binge eating because, and I mentioned earlier, because it's not always necessarily the case that it's true, but perceived feelings of restriction or deprivation. We can think that we have these limitations on us whilst we're in a weight loss phase. And what does that do to us? When we aspire to healthy eating, maybe we're doing it from such a Puritan perspective that it simply becomes unrealistic, that we go out of our minds, that we get neurotic about these things, that we never eat out, that we're really fearful when we have to eat out because there's a family celebration that we can't get out of. What this can do to you mentally is really overburdening, really, really stressful. And so I think consistency over perfection is a great mantra in many, many ways, but particularly as it relates to binge eating. Because if you can just be accepting of the occasional impracticality, the occasional mistake, the occasional day where maybe something you ate, something small, was slightly less than perfect. But in the grand scheme of things, doing that has allowed you to stay adhering to a healthy eating plan over the long term, rather than working so hard that it just becomes completely unfeasible, impractical, and drives you crazy. That's a win. So again, this is a scale. I don't want you to be going towards moderation. I don't want you to have a terrible diet. I want you to shoot for perfection. But think about what's going to allow you to actually be consistent and sustain these good results. What can you actually adhere to versus what does the textbook say is like Puritan? Because if we just went by the textbook, we'd be on, would be having much, I would be drinking personally a lot more green smoothies, a lot more juices than I do. A higher component of my diet would be more fruits and veggies. I would have a lot more raw in my diet. Is that practical for me? No. Is that what I enjoy doing? No. Therefore, it's not practical also. And so that just doesn't work for me personally. I could make it work because of my mindset. But is that really something that's going to stick long term? No, absolutely not. There's a reason why the way I do after years and years of doing this. I'm not new to this. I've been doing this for years and years, and you guys have seen. I've now got a track record, quote unquote, on YouTube and Instagram of putting out consistent content. You guys know that I've been eating the same here. There's one or two things I've changed my stance on ever so slightly, but we're talking about 1 or 2%, but very rarely. But I pretty much eat the same as I always have done. There's occasional rotation. I say as I always have done since starting this channel anyway, and over on Instagram as well. You can scroll back, you can see the philosophy, the approach in which I eat, and it hasn't changed. Why do I say that? Because there's a reason I've landed on that, and there's a reason why I've stuck to that, because I can adhere to it. I haven't forced it. I haven't forced what is Puritan. Excuse me, folks, you may have just lost me for a second there. I haven't forced what is Puritan to the extent that it's made my journey impossible. So consistency over perfection is a big thing as it relates to many aspects of weight loss, but certainly with binge eating too. You could drive yourself so crackers with this that you're just like, go, okay, I'm sick of this. I feel so deprived. I feel so limited here. I'm just going to go and and before you know it, you've consumed 2,000 calories. You feel absolutely awful. You've ruined that day, maybe that week from a weight loss perspective. You've done that so much damage. And you've reinforced these bad behaviors. You've reminded yourself that you are weak. Because sometimes the adverse consequences of binge eating are not on the scale. Sometimes you can sort of get away with a little, binging spree once in a while. You can sort of get away with it on the scale. It's not going to ruin everything. One bad day, one binge eating session, it's not going to ruin everything in terms of weeks and months worth of good weight loss actions and habits. But what it can do on a deeper level, in terms of, it can really interrupt and corrupt, maybe is the best word, that internal transformation that's happening as you go along your weight loss journey. You can really set yourself back mentally and emotionally by binge eating. So sometimes it's not always the scale that gets damaged most of all. It can be you, your identity, your beliefs, your habits, and so on. Those internal mechanisms, let's say, those mental and emotional aspects to weight loss, they can get more heavily damaged by these binges. So let's remember that. Another concept I touched on earlier was forgiveness versus chastisement. Folks, you must be able to forgive yourself when you do binge. The reason why is because if you berate yourself, if you show no mercy, if you are unforgiving when you binge and you berate and still 2 to 3 days later you're really angry and you feel very guilty about what you've done, you subconsciously communicate, and maybe even consciously communicate to yourself that you don't deserve this, that this can never happen for you, that you can never stop binge eating. You make it such a big deal that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that you end up doing it again, that you end up destined rather to do it again at some point. So you need to be able to forgive yourself. Now, again, I said earlier, this is a spectrum. You don't want to offer yourself so much forgiveness that you ruin your own standards, that you apologize to yourself for everything, that you are so forgiving that you have no ambition to improve, that you're so lenient with yourself that your standards are down here. No. You have to be somewhat intolerant of this. You have to set the boundary. So it's not about being outrageously forgiving. It's just about knowing when to forgive yourself for these things and not letting that guilt and that anger about a binge eating session roll on for days and days and days and days. That's really going to affect your efforts. It has to be something that you feel down about for a little while, and then it sort of nips in the bud. And like with any sort of emotion that you go through, it sort of passes, and at the time it feels awful, and then a day later we look back and we go, cool, I don't know why I was giving myself such a hard time. I feel much better about things today. I'm back on track. Okay, so you have to have some semblance of forgiveness. Just don't go too far with it, I would stress. And then with chastisement, I don't see these two things on the same spectrum. I don't think you've got forgiveness here and chastisement here, but I do think they're interlinked. But you've got to give yourself a hard time, folks. Just don't berate yourself so much, as I say, that you keep this guilt and anger festering for too long. You have to chastise yourself a little bit so that you make sure that you know this is unacceptable behavior. You have to feel a little bit guilty about this. It's good that you feel a little bit guilty about this. That shows you that you've done something that inherently you know is wrong, and it crosses a line for you. So you have to set that boundary. So if you do give yourself a hard time for making a mistake, you set that boundary. If you don't give yourself a hard time for making that mistake and you're too forgiving, so you need to be forgiving, but when you're too forgiving, you don't set that clear boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. You have to make it somewhat binary, folks. You have to make it so that there is good behaviors for weight loss, bad behaviors for weight loss and wellness and your life. You have to make it so here is the person I want to be, here is the person I don't want to be. You have to make it at times that black and white, that hot and cold, that binary. And without some sort of chastisement, you can't do that. Without some sort of forgiveness, you can't do that either. Make sense? So think about forgiveness versus chastisement. You've got to strike the balance there. There's no magic formula. Sometimes you're going to use one more than use the other. You have to trust yourself intuitively to know when that is. It's tough to do. With experience, it comes. To heal binge eating, I think you need a multifaceted approach. I mentioned this earlier. The way I've covered this, hopefully you've got that impression from me. Binge eating, you absolutely need a multifaceted approach. I have given you some instructions on how a plant-based diet can really help you with binge eating, but ultimately you need to track the underlying behavior, folks. You really, really do. That is what's going to lead to huge results here. You can just carry this behavior over to any diet and it will manifest at some time. So you need to tackle that underlying behavior. Hopefully I've given you some tips as to how you can do that today. But the thing to stress is you need a multifaceted approach. Break that pattern. As I mentioned earlier, reinforce the healthy body image. If you're just joining me now and you're really struggling with binge eating, please refresh back. Please go right back to the start of this live stream. I was about to say to a couple of minutes in, but right to the start of this live stream, because we jumped straight into this one. And work your way through it, because there's a lot I've covered here, but hopefully you've got some good advice. And then I think other quick tools for you. Journaling can really help. I mentioned that earlier. Don't skip meals and get really, really ravenously hungry. Now, again, there's a difference between binge eating and being physically hungry. That's worth stressing. But when you are physically hungry, are you more maybe likely to binge? Are you more likely to go past satiation? Yes, you absolutely are. Exercise is really helpful. Going and seeing nature, having some fun in your life. Maybe you're a bit bored. Maybe you're a bit lonely. Maybe it's a bit of fun for you. I often say that leisure is definitely overrated, and probably there's a lot of people, especially in the UK, that have quote unquote too much leisure time, but you got to have some fun, folks. You got to let your hair down. Now, fun doesn't mean tequila shots and donuts, obviously, but you got to put a smile on your face, and you got to have that time to sort of get out your head. As I say, exercise, hanging out with friends, comedy is a really good one for that as well. I actually have a client, not right now, a former client actually, who every time, this isn't binge eating related, it's slightly different, but similar patterns going on. Every time they had a craving, they really suffered from late afternoon cravings. Every time they had a craving, we got them to watch, I think it was 20 minutes of their favorite comedian on YouTube or their favorite comedian's podcast. And I think it really helped them from feedback. So that's a good thing to do as well. Laughing can really help you break out of that state and that mood that you're currently in. So having fun can help you do that. And lastly, but most certainly not least, address your problems. If there is a recurring cause of stress that is causing the binge eating, if there are underlying feelings of trauma, although I stick a huge asterisk on that because it's trickier to deal with, try and troubleshoot, try and come up with some solutions as to how you're going to get over this. And when I say get over this, I use that again fairly loosely. Maybe the correct term would be put it to bed, to get acceptance over it. For some people, they cite meditation. A lot of people, especially with trauma, they really like breath work. I've heard that can do amazing things for those that have had terrible accidents or abuse in their past. So with trauma-based eating, might be worth looking into breath work. Again, this is not my area of expertise, folks. These are just things I would consider if I was in your shoes and really struggling with this. But address your problems. Maybe, again, you're binge eating out of boredom. And for you, this is very much my story in my student days. For you, it's about getting some things on your plate. It's about having some more personal and professional responsibility so you aren't so bored, so you've got things to do, so you have responsibility in your life. But try and fix that problem if there is a trend to it. If that's tricky, but if there is a trend to it anyway, try and fix the cause of that problem that starts that trend, that really triggers you in the first instance, if there's a trend there. If it's always stress that causes you to binge eat, what can you do? Is there something that you're not addressing in your professional life? Is there something, and obviously in an ideal world, there'll be people that, they're in a job that maybe is far too high stress than is manageable, and it's really causing them problems in other areas of your life, maybe binging, for example. And maybe it's not practical that they change their job right now, for instance. So there are things that you need to hatch a bit more of a long-term plan for. But think about what you could do today to maybe start putting some of these things to bed and accepting these things more so, or managing these triggers, let's say, more so. And my final point on this, folks, is get specialized help. Do, please. Again, I've mentioned this several times, but it is worth stressing. I'm not qualified in this area. It's not, frankly, my area of expertise. Obviously, it's something that I've learned a great deal about, but it isn't my area of expertise. Go and get some professional help with this, folks, if you're really struggling with it. If you're in the UK, check out eatingdisorders.org.uk. That's eatingdisorders.org.uk. They have some good advice there, I would certainly say. So I think that's the end of the topic, folks. Not quite the end of the live stream. I'm going to read through some of your questions and comments here. But first of all, I would like to prioritize any questions there are about binge eating. So get those in the chat now. I'll give a 30-second window or a minute window for you to put binge eating questions in. And then if I don't get any, or if I don't get too many, I'll do those that are covered, that I feel competent answering. And then I'll go back to your other comments, folks. So stay with me if you're here today and hoping that I will answer your question. I'm just going to give a minute here and prioritize the subject we're talking about. So if anyone has any questions about binge eating, write them in the chat. For more weight loss resources, as always, folks, you can head over to naturalweightlossmastery.com. I may even do a second live stream later today to celebrate 25k subscribers that we've now hit on this channel. So maybe that's an apt moment for me to say thank you very much for your support. Maybe I'll do more of those thank yous in a later live stream if I do another one today. But yeah, 25k, that's pretty cool. So thank you, folks. It doesn't feel like 2 minutes ago. It's been slow growth, frankly, but it still doesn't feel like long ago that I had 50 subscribers, then 100, then 874, and then that agonizing journey to 1,000 that seems to take forever. And then from 1,000, it sort of shoots up a bit more, and the algorithm is a lot more generous and kind to you as a creator. Doesn't seem to be any binge specific questions in here, or maybe there are further deeper in the chat, but none have come in, so I'll go back to the start. Alan says salt needs salty or sweet after dinner. Well, I mean, it's tricky, Alan. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you feel that you need salt or sweets after dinner because of years and years of these habits, because you've taught yourself, like with binge eating, you've learned this pattern of behavior. Maybe there is something in your last meal that doesn't quite hit the spot that well, and that's leaving you with those feelings. And if we just adjusted your final meal of the day, you might be all right. Hard to say. But I think the thing I will challenge you on this, Alan, is this your perception, or is this actually genuinely your need? Do you need these things, or you just feel you need these things? Do you see what I mean? Make that separation for a more honest assessment. Larry says, due to lack of availability of healthier options in restaurants, junk and non-vegan foods are convenience foods. How much time do you spend meal planning? Do I even meal plan, Larry, would be my question to myself in response to that. Occasionally, I mean, this is different for me because I work for myself nowadays. When I used to be in the world of work, what I would do is, whilst I was eating breakfast, I would make lunch and throw that in a Tupperware container. So that would take maybe 15 or 20 minutes, depending on what that lunch was. So maybe in that sense, 15, 20 minutes a day of meal prep. Depends what you mean by meal planning. Do you just mean how long a meal takes me to, do you mean cooking time? Do you also mean the time, spent on writing a grocery list and thinking about food shopping and whatnot? In which case, I couldn't put a number on it, but my answer is very quick nowadays. I've been pretty speedy at this. I'm pretty speedy at this after years of doing it, if you see what I mean. And I'm pretty habitual and frankly, fairly repetitive with how I eat. Every now and again I change it up so I don't get bored, but Nothing extravagant by any means. So I don't spend a lot of time meal planning or prepping or anything like that. My lifestyle is now in a good position where I don't have to worry about that stuff too much. Again, sometimes if there's a dish, here's maybe a caveat, Larry. If there's a dish that I don't make all that often because maybe its cooking time takes a bit longer, such as, or it just makes more sense to double up, like maybe a curry or the lentil dal. I had a lentil dal a couple of days ago. I think I posted it on my Instagram a few days back. I doubled up. I made way more than would be required for one serving, and then I kept that for a couple of days, if that makes sense. But usually I don't do that, frankly. I just make each meal as and when it comes nowadays because of my lifestyle. Dory says, good morning, Ryan. Wow, good morning, Dory. Thanks for joining. Loyal as ever, Dory. Thank you. Live chat early. Might be early for you, Dory. It's gone midday for me. Good morning from Argentina. Hi. Good morning from the UK. Or good afternoon now from the UK. What's 801010? Yeah, that's been answered. I love listening to you. Your accent is so beautiful. That's very kind. Thank you. I need this binging discussion. Great. I know it's head game with me. Good. Well, hopefully this provided some useful info for you there. One sweet life. I think that once your body is well nourished, the binge eating and the cravings stop. Well, Andrea, I agree with you to a degree. That can help when you nourish yourself well, when you feed yourself, quote unquote, the right foods in a good amount. You can soften the blow of binge eating for sure. You can make it less likely. You can make it less frequent, but you have to fix the behavior too. I don't know if you were here for my live stream where I covered that, but it's really important. It's really important. There's a lot of vegans and plant-based dieters out there right now who they've been told that because they can eat well on this diet that it will automatically fix their binge eating, and it's not working, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm doing something wrong, like everyone else seems to be fixed from this. I've heard great testimonials, other YouTubers talking about how their binge eating went away. Folks, you must fix the underlying behavior. I can't stress it enough. It can help to eat lots of these high volume fiber-rich foods. As I said, I made that point, so I'm not disagreeing, but yeah, I think you absolutely have to fix the underlying behavior. You have to think about, number one, fixing the underlying behavior and then trying to do so. Brenda says, this is such a great live. I'm glad, Brenda, because for me, I don't think I've been coherent with this. I actually think my worst live streams are the ones where I've got notes prepared because it's a bit rather than me just letting myself flow a bit more. I think here, I had my notes, I also flowed. It was like a 50-50 and it just didn't work. And I end up not being so coherent, but I'm glad that you got some use out of it anyway, Brenda. Maybe I'm being very self-critical there, but I don't think it's my best. But who cares? I got the information I wanted to out, so hopefully some people really benefit from that. What do you think about fruit as a dessert? I think it's wonderful. Christina says, when I binge eat, it's more of an enjoyment, but I always feel guilty after. Christina, what I challenge you with on this is it necessarily binge eating? Go back to the start of this live stream, listen through to where I listed the characteristics of binge eating, and then ask yourself if this is actually binge eating and not just a regular sort of craving that you once in a while give into. I'm not going to repeat myself. When you go back to the live stream, you'll learn about the difference. This is really important. And why I picked this up with you, Christina, is because you mentioned the word enjoyment. For most people, for most binge eaters, it's not a particularly enjoyable process. So that's why I picked up on it. You might be right. It might be binge eating, but I really encourage you, if you missed it, to go back to the start of my live stream and then please reassess. Because I come out with a definition for binge eating there. I list off the characteristics. I mention how it's different from a regular craving or indulgence. And if you watch that and you still believe it's binge eating, okay, there is a good chance that it therefore is a type of binge eating. Christina, it's Christina again. I feel like I'm on a roller coaster because I would tell myself I'm going to eat healthy and try to lose weight, but I always end up slipping. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there, Christina. This could be limiting beliefs. It could be impatience. It could be a binging problem. I don't know that it is. It could be cravings. I really want to help you, Christina. What do you think stops you? Is a question to you. I'm putting you on the spot there. Larry says planning seems to be more necessary with a busy work schedule. I absolutely agree. It can also be a busy home life too. I mean, I do have a busy schedule, but I have lots of freedom in how little or bit how busy a day can be for me, how I structure that day. And so I can just prioritize. I can prioritize things in a way that somebody that has a different working life can't. I can prioritize things, I think, more easily. I'm more, the word that would have simplified my whole 30-second spiel here would be flexible. I'm a bit more flexible because of what I do, which I'm grateful for eternally. Wendy the vegan, weekends when I'm not on schedule is when I binge. Yeah, that's a common one. How do we eat for health rather than for taste? You can't fully ever do this. It's unrealistic to think. So that's my first comment to you. It's unrealistic to think that one day you will only eat for function, for nourishment rather than taste. You have taste buds. You have them for a reason. You are supposed to enjoy food. It has to have this reciprocal nature to it, to whereby it encourages your brain to go and eat more. It's a survival mechanism. So you have to enjoy food. And you're not going to stay on track with healthy eating if you don't somewhat at least enjoy what you're eating. I think the distinction to make is that you've got to do this for function more than for entertainment. I think that's the thing. So I don't think it's about doing it for health rather than for taste. I think it's doing it for health rather than entertainment. I think that's the thing to, I think that's the reframe, is change it from taste to entertainment, because you're always going to taste. You're always going to want to taste good things. You can't override that human condition. You can't override that normal human urge. But what you can do is try and take it off this metaphorical pedestal. It's not metaphorical, this absolute pedestal in your mind, to whereby you hold food in such an esteem that it literally is your day. You just hear people talk, oh, I can't wait for the cheesecake later, can't wait to go out to eat on Friday. It's literally their life, what they eat. And so you need to take it off that platform in your mind, if that makes sense, off that pedestal, and make it more about the function. How do you do that? One time, just through repeating this process. How else? It's a really great question. How else? I'm not sure. I'm not sure off the top of my head. This is a good future video for me. I've actually covered it in the past. There's just nothing springing into my mind. You have to take it off that pedestal. And how do you do that? Say no to things is an obvious one. Like, the more you say no to meals out, the more you become less reliant on them. Again, when you're busy, when you're a fulfilled person, if you're taking care of children, if you've got, a great spiritual life, if you're on purpose, on mission, you haven't got time to think about food all day long. You haven't got time to put food up on a pedestal. So I think maybe that's why I'm struggling to answer this question, is because for me, it hasn't been relevant since my student days. I haven't really thought about it for me personally since my student days. The reason why food was on such a pedestal for me in my student days was because I had time for it to be, because I was bored, because I was deeply unfulfilled, because I was unstimulated, I was lost. And so that's why I created it on a pedestal. So how do you take it off that pedestal? Diminish the importance it has to you, diminish the value you place on it. Yeah. How do you do that? By having other things in your life, by having meaning elsewhere, not food. By not having such a dry and dreary existence that food is everything to you. That's the answer. I can't really think of anything better now I've thought about it a bit more. Yeah. I'm missing questions here, folks, because the chat keeps skipping, so apologies. I will try and come back to them. I'll scroll up in a second. Andrea, excuse me for pronunciation, says, I drink a lot of water. I have a big soup or salad before a main meal, so as not to overeat. That's a cool tactic. Yeah, I've heard people using that well before. Christina says, okay, Ryan, I will go back to the beginning of this video and figure this out. Yeah, thank you. Christina, you might be right. So maybe my challenge is misplaced. And I'm not necessarily saying that you're not a binge eater, but just the fact you use the word enjoyment, I don't know. So go back, have a look, and then we'll have another chat about it if you're still with me, or shoot me a message on Instagram. I'll be happy to help further. Folks, I think we're going to wrap up here because I didn't realise how long I've been going. So time for me to grab some food, actually, on that note. So I hope you all have taken something useful from this. Let me know your feedback in the chat or in the comments and whatnot. I hope it's been useful to you. And I'll catch you very soon. Thank you very much for 25k subscribers. As I say, I'm not going to promise it, but I might be live in a couple of hours again to sort of celebrate that 25k. Usually when I hit these sort of milestones, I do some little giveaway or at least a thank you sale. So when I do come back on, there might be some giveaways or competitions or other announcements, I don't know. But yeah, I'll see what I can come up with in this time. I've got a couple of coaching calls as well later. So let's see if I can fit one in, but I would like to do that. If not, definitely live again soon. Let me know if you found this valuable, folks, and I'll see you very soon. Thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it. Speak soon.